name is Greg Steinmetz. This is Group Eastern 3 Behavior Replication Project presentation. Myself, I currently live in Florida. I've been in the ABA field for about 2.5 years. This is Brittany.
Hi, like Greg said, my name is Brittany. I currently live in Indiana, and I've been in ABA for about 2.5 years.
My name is Lauren. I live in Ohio, and I have been in ABA for 9 years. I'm going to start off with the literature review. As we all know, physical activity can help create healthy habits and help you live longer. According to Harris, clinical and epidemiological evidence supports that leisure time, physical activity, occupational activity, and physical fitness are ways that can be associated to reduced mortality, heart disease, increased bone density, and reduced risk for colon cancer, and so on. That's cited in Dishman 1991, page 345. Another part of our study was setting goals. So setting goals is another way to help keep up with the running activity, especially in a group. And according to Ward and Carnes, a study that they did in 2002, they did goal setting through public postings for football players, and the baseline ranged from 60 to 80%. And then by the end of the intervention, their skills increased to from 90 to 100%, which is really, really awesome. Another way that we can track goals is through our mobile devices, which we will talk a little bit more about. But the use of mobile devices is pretty common in today's world. Pretty much everyone has their phone on them all the time. And according to Johnson, Huffman, and Thornton in 2014, it says that studies used a variety of software apps on mobile devices, and amongst their findings, mobile devices did increase physical activity using different mobile technologies, such as short messaging, smartphone, native app, and personal digiting assistants. Next up is the purpose.
So the overall purpose of this study and why we replicated this study was to determine the effects of goal setting and performance feedback and how that can affect the number of miles ran per week per participant. So the whole basic idea was that we wanted to increase the amount of time we spent running, but we also wanted to increase the distance we ran each week. And so that was the first purpose of trying to start this study. So we started this study as part of our group project. So we are 3 graduate level students. We are ranged age from 25 to 32, 2 female, 1 male, as you can see in our presentation. It was part of our graduate level class for this class. And we all showed a desire to increase the number of miles we ran per week, and also just the number of times we ran per week. That was all really important to us. We wanted to increase our physical activity and just be overall more healthy, like Lauren was talking about, and this was one way to do that. At the beginning of the study, none of us showed any injuries or any signs of injuries or any conditions that would pose a health risk as we would be running for this study. One participant, Lauren, did develop an injury throughout this study, which we will talk more about and kind of how that affected our study. But we were able to continue the study after the injury with a modified intervention. And so talking about the materials of this study, at the first meeting that we all had, we decided to download the Map My Run app. This app is developed by Under Armour. And we used this app to collect data for every run that we recorded. We took the definition of a running episode from the original study from WAC, Crossland, and Miltenberg, 2014, and they define a running episode as a continuous run at a speed faster than a brisk walk, again being defined as 4 miles per hour or 6.4 kilometers per hour. So again, we did apply it to this study, and we included time on a treadmill, running track, course, outside, inside, anything like that was applicable to this definition. And we're going to go ahead and go back to Lauren, and she's going to talk more details about how we did collect data.
So for data collection, as Brittany mentioned, we all downloaded the Map My Run app by Under Armour. This allowed all of us to track our running activity from start to finish. So in order to start the workout, we actually had to hit a button on our phone, start workout, and then to finish, we had to hit the pause workout button, and then we had to hit another button, hold to finish, to stop the running activity, and then we had to save it so that it would save on the Map My Run app. So the Map My Run can also be tracked through a website at www.mapmyrun.com. And a way that we kept our data collection was through an Excel spreadsheet through the Google Drive. And we would input our miles, and we would also screenshot our mileage after a run, and we would send it through the Google Hangouts Messenger for inter-observer agreement, which we will all talk a little bit more about later. On to baseline with Greg.
Yeah, and to add on to Lauren, we both ran outside and tracked their run that way. For myself, I tracked my run by logging my workout in from the treadmill, and we will discuss that more further in the presentation. Baseline, participant 1, myself, 2 weeks of baseline, and participant 2, Lauren, did 3 weeks of baseline, and participant 3, Brittany, did. There were no long-term or short-term goals set during this baseline. Only after 2 weeks did I set a goal, and then after 3, Lauren set a goal, and then after 4, Brittany set a goal. This baseline was basically any amount we wanted to run at any distance during the week. Continue on to intervention, which I will do. We collected our baseline, meeting weekly. Each participant in the group discussed what goal they wanted to reach by the end of the study, the long-term distance goal. We also set a short-term goal that we would go on to the next week. Baseline was about 0.3, or even smaller than that. I started off small because I do not have a history of being a runner. I did set a goal of about 2.5 miles. We were required to run at least 3 times a week in the intervention, at or above the set criterion level that we set for ourselves. Our goal for the next week if we had reached those goals. Then we would decide if we wanted to stay at the same goal for the next week or go below. Meetings were conducted every week on Thursday evening to discuss our runs for the week, if we were able to achieve our goal or if we were not able to. Discuss what our new goal would be. I will also go on to IOA and treatment integrity. In this group, track their runs on the app run that Brittany was talking about. The numbers tracked by the app file that was shared between all of the participants on Google Drive. The treatment intervention was discussed during each group meeting to ensure the treatment integrity was maintained throughout the study. And it happened to be 100% because we were always on track and meeting each week each other our runs through the app. So all the group members would refer back to the original studies to clarify the question and then to confirm the result during the study replication. And as on Brittany's screen, you will see that there are examples of how the data was tracked for participants on Map My Run. My IOA, Here's Lauren's. So those are examples of how we would track our workouts. Sorry. We will go on to results.
Okay, so I will be talking about the results of our study and just kind of going over the data that we collected as we went through the study. This first chart that you guys will see, it's the participants' weekly goals and the goal achievement during baseline and treatment. And so as you can see, that each week is shown, with each participant in one column. It's shown when baseline data occurred and then also what our weekly goals were. As you guys look at this chart, you should note that the asterisk next to the goal means that that goal was met. For example, if you look, week 3, Greg set a 1 mile goal, which means that the goal was that he would run 1 mile 3 times per week. That goal was achieved. He did run at least 2 out of the 3 instances to get that goal. And as you go through, you can see when goals were made and when they were not. Another note to look at while you're looking at this chart is during week 5 and 6, Lauren had an injury and per doctor's orders was not allowed to run. And so she was required to take a break from this intervention. And then after that intervention, we implemented a new intervention, modified intervention for walking, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But those are the goals, weekly goals that we all set during the time. And then in this chart, we can look at the total weekly distance run. Excuse me. And you can kind of see when we did baseline and all of that kind of stuff. It shows the range, average, and our overall range and average. So our overall range lasted between 0 and 16.5 miles run per week. And then the average per week was about 4.2 miles run, which is kind of cool to see that. And then next, I would like to show you guys the graph. So as we've kind of discussed, this study was a multiple baseline study. And this is the research they used. And so going off the original study, this is what our graph ended up being. Again, we can see Greg started baseline first, and he, after the intervention began, had a steady increase in the number of total miles ran per week. Lauren is the second participant in this graph, and she went through baseline, then started the intervention where there's only 1 point, and then during injury, she was at 0 due to doctor's orders. And then starting in week 7, we introduced a modified intervention, which was just number of miles walked for her so that she could still participate. And then for me, the last participant, number 3, my baseline data was kind of all over the place, and we'll talk more about it, but I was actually training for a half marathon and did run a half marathon during week 13, during week 3, excuse me, which is 13.1 miles, hence why my baseline data is a little unstable. And then my intervention started in week 5 with that. And that is all of the results that we had, just kind of talking about and looking at exactly what the data showed as we went along. And so now I would like to just kind of start it off, and we're going to talk about the conclusions and just how we're going to talk about the limitations first and just the different limitations that we faced and kind of what made this harder or what made it a little different from the original. And I'm going to have Greg go ahead and start off with those limitations.
Thank you, Brittany. To start off with the limitations, the antecedent manipulation. As some of you may remember, in the beginning of the school year, we had a hurricane hit Florida, and weather is pretty out of whack. So I decided not to do my runs outside, extreme heat or just random rain that we get. On the inside, on a treadmill, limitations that some would run into on the outside. I did not face some of the limitations that the other participants in the group had. I had an injury, a lot of stretching I did, but that was mostly because I do a lot of cardio during the week with basketball. Me, in terms of some limitations I did kind of face in the week was times a week, because sometimes my work schedule and my school schedule did not permit me to run at all that day. exhaustion or just too much work to do. I would say that some other limitations that in this study is we were lucky enough to have a phone and have a plan and download apps. That could be one limitation in the study, especially if you were running outside. It's kind of hard to keep track. Talk more about other limitations will be Lauren.
Thanks, Greg. So one of the limitations that I had, as we mentioned, was I had an injury. Brittany is going to display a nice picture of kind of what I had going on. So if you guys can see, there's the picture of the iliacal band syndrome, which is the IT band, which goes from your knee to your hip. And I experienced some IT band issues. It was inflamed, it was sore. And a way that you guys can avoid an injury like that is using a foam roller, which is what I have right here. And that will help keep your IT bands from tightening up. So essentially that's what happened to my right IT band. And so that is one injury that can happen while you're running. This picture also shows another injury that's pretty common among runners, which is shin splints, which is in your shins. And it's when the muscles behind the tibia get inflamed, and I think it rubs up against your muscles. So that also can be pretty painful. I did not suffer from that injury. But those are a couple of the injuries that you can have while running. And like I said, the IT band injury is what kept me from continuing to run per doctor's orders. I would say that another limitation for me, at least, was I did run outside. Or I started to run outside and I ended up walking outside. But in Ohio, it tends to get a lot colder. So the last couple weeks, it's been a lot colder here in Ohio. And those were the big limitations for me for this study. On to Brittany.
I also had some limitations according to the weather as well, where also I live in Indiana. So also the change in weather did affect me. Probably started around week like 7. So week 7 and 8, it just got colder and it was a lot harder to be motivated to go outside and run in the cold. So I do think that affected the amount of running that I did engage in during the last 2 weeks of my study. I also know that training for the half marathon really, really limited just kind of the overall effectiveness of this intervention for me. So when we first started this intervention during weeks 1, 2, I was training for the half marathon and did, as I said earlier, ran a half marathon in week 3. And so my baseline data looks like I ran a ton, which I did. I ran a lot, but then it kind of drops off after that. And so I noticed that because of this, I had a lot of motivation and I had a really good goal to run this half marathon. And so I was really motivated and I ran a lot. And then after that, the motivation just I didn't have a good goal anymore. So the small goals per week did help a little bit, but they weren't as effective as a big goal of running a half marathon. So I think that really affected me, and just kind of the change in goal was difficult, and just kind of trying to navigate that did limit kind of the effectiveness of this study replication for me. I could definitely say that. I would say another limitation we had for this study was just the length of time. I would be really interested to see what happened if we did continue the study for more weeks beyond what we were able to. So since we were in class, it's due at a certain time, we had to stop so we could make sure to get all of our data together, which did leave us only 8 weeks for baseline and intervention data. And for me, I did 4 weeks of baseline, so I only had 4 weeks of the intervention. So for me, compared to Greg, he had a lot more time with the intervention and was able to kind of see those effects a little bit differently. And I was not able to see them quite as effectively through that. And so we'll go ahead and go on to Greg, and he's going to talk about just how all of these limitations and just everything that we've seen through our data and just kind of what conclusions we can come up with based on this information.
Thank you, Brittany. Yeah, to tie it all up, I really enjoy this intervention. I do think it does work. I think it does depend on a lot of what, coming from myself, I come from a very competitive, sports-oriented family. It was built for me. I enjoy goals and reaching them. I've done it in every sport I've ever played. And even though I'm not a runner, with setting a goal, I was very motivated to reach that goal. Positive praise coming from my other participants, was really big positive reinforcement for me, and it really increased my motivation each week. Having a long-term goal, but that weekly meeting really did push me each week to keep going and increase my goal. I got really lucky with the flexibility in schedule where I was able to go to the gym, and have a gym that does have hours where it's open, where I can go after work. I didn't have any injuries. I think I benefited, especially from running inside. I think that helped me a lot. Lauren stated before, I have a history of shin splints. I get them a lot. I'm 6'5". I have a lot of foot problems, a lot of shin problems, but running on a treadmill inside seemed to help me a lot. I would recommend this study. I believe it works. I believe self-monitoring and goal setting are ways to intervene for someone who's trying to exercise more and get in shape. And to talk more about some of the line.
Thanks, Greg. So for me, despite my limitation of an injury, I feel like the intervention was effective. If you were to take out those 2 weeks, you would still see an incline in my miles ran per week, which I think is pretty cool. And I would say too that meeting once a week with Greg and Brittany to talk about our goals was a really good motivator, and it just kind of kept you going. We would also send our miles through Google Messenger to each other. And then we would, say, hey, good job, good job. So just that social interaction, the accountability, I think was really helpful. And I do think that this intervention is effective in increasing your running. And to talk more about that is Brittany.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, so this particular study in this time frame that I participated in the study, it was not effective for me. As you can tell from my intervention versus my baseline data, the number of miles per week did go down. Again, like as I've been talking about, it was mostly affected by that half marathon, just kind of unfortunate and weird timing. But I would actually like to talk about my training for the half marathon. So my training for the half marathon was actually similar to this study in a way. So I'm going to pull up a picture and just kind of, this is as an example. This is a training schedule that I actually based a lot of my training for. And so as you can see, for example, in week 1, the goal was to run 3 miles, then 2 miles, then 3 miles, and then 4 miles. And so I did have weekly goals that I set every week to make sure I was running enough to prepare for this half marathon. And also along kind of with our study, we talk a lot about the social interaction and the social accountability, which was very effective for Lauren and Greg. And it was pretty effective for me. I still did run after my half marathon, but it wasn't as effective as my goals before. And so for me, when I was training for the half marathon before the study occurred, I did have those goals set per week. I had them written down on a calendar and I would check them off when I did them. So I was able to see my goals and see them be met. And then I also had the social accountability with my husband and also my friends who I was telling them, hey, I'm running a half marathon. And then they would ask, how's training going? So that was the social accountability that kept me going to keep training. I think the big difference between that kind of motivation versus this study is that I also had like an end goal. So I had this race to look forward to, which is a big goal and was very motivating for me. And I would say with this kind of a situation, there wasn't as good of an end goal for me. And so it wasn't as motivating. So after that race happened, I felt a lot less motivation. And so I would say in conclusion with that, I would say this intervention is effective. It just was not in this particular circumstance for me. But overall, the concepts of this intervention are definitely effective. And I think they can be used to increase running or just other physical activities. I think it could be used pretty much for anything. Greg is going to talk a little bit more about kind of the differences between the original study and then the study that we, like how we replicated it.
Thank you, Brittany. Yeah, study, I believe you replicated it as best as possible. Obviously, the length was not the same, short due to our semester. And it's still, you could see the same effects were happening. I do, like Lauren, like Brittany said, I would be very how our distances would have been had we had a longer study. Brittany would have ran more considering she is a runner, and the half marathon shows that. I believe Lauren coming back from injury, being in physical therapy would have helped as well. Another way our studies were different, they obviously have more participants, be college students. And while we are graduate level students, I believe we all have full-time jobs working in the ABA field. Those can be a little tiring at times. Those are some of the differences, but we kept it, the IOA I thought was very good considering they had a researcher they reported to. We were very meet each week to maintain perfect IOA and treatment integrity. Some about the comparison and contrast will be Lauren.
Thanks, Greg. So as Greg mentioned, the compare and contrast, the difference in the study was that they met with a researcher where we didn't have that. We met with each other. And as we mentioned before, we did that once a week on Thursday nights where we would set our goals with each other and kind of update each other on how our runs were going. For instance, when Brittany was running her half marathon, how that was going and when that happened. And for me, when I had my injury and how we were going to change or modify the intervention so that I could still participate. So that was kind of how it was a little bit different. Now on to applications for the clinic.
And actually, I have another difference that was kind of a big difference. Well, it could be. We don't really know if it was a big difference or not. But the materials that we used, the running app, it could have made a really big difference. In the original study, they were given a Nike Fit band. So it was given to them and they had it on their wrist at all times. And it was automatically synced to information online. And so for them, it was a lot easier to track their runs. So in the original study, when they went on a run, they just pressed a little button and it just got sent right to them. For us, no, it wasn't too much harder, but it did take a little more effort. We had to pull out our phones. We had to get the app ready. Then we had to save it and we had to make sure it was good. Then we had to upload our IOA data and all that information, which could have had an effect on how often we ran because, it did take a little bit of work to do that. And so that was one difference. And also just kind of having a bracelet on is just a lot more convenient than trying to carry around a phone while you're running. So that was another main difference in kind of the original study versus our replication of the study. And now we're just going to talk about what this means for us now. So how can we apply this in our clinics? How can we apply this to ourselves? And then how can you apply this as well? And Greg will start us off.
Thank you, Brittany. Yeah, like she said, I really like this study. I could apply this in two different ways, one for myself and the way I work with my clients. Intervention made me think a lot of how I would implement an intervention with my own clients, especially if it was something different and creative and unique. monitoring. See how that participants had and myself could also happen to our client. So we could keep an understanding open of how our client are is reflecting in an intervention, and how certain things can happen and how we need to modify it on the spot, like we did with Lauren. The ways that I could feel like we could apply it in the clinic. And as for myself, as I need to do more self-monitoring. I think I am more effective as a person when I do self-monitor. I am all over the place sometimes. I can be unorganized. On track towards a goal, I am meeting with it weekly. I am much more effective in my work and in my relationships. I feel are applicable in the clinic and in my personal life. That will be Lauren.
Thanks, Greg. So for me, I think ways that it can be applicable in the job, in the profession, I think this displayed a good representation of like social accountability amongst our peers. So using that as a motivator for maybe some of the clients that we work with that really rely on their peers, we could use self-monitoring and just setting goals amongst their peers. I think that's another good way to kind of use this study in the future. As for myself, it definitely has helped me realize that I can get back into running again, and that social accountability amongst my peers is really helpful in just the goal setting week by week. I think that plays a huge role, and that can go as far as just running or setting goals for your career, for school, and other things in your life. And to talk more about that is Brittany.
Cool. Thanks, Lauren. I think for me, the biggest application that I can take is just for myself. And it's kind of a very direct application that I'm taking, but just to continue my running habits, I'm just setting goals and then just keep having people keep me accountable is a very simple way to apply it, but it is important in my life. So I do want to continue to run after I have run this half marathon, and I do plan to train for more races in the future. And I do plan on using goal setting and also social accountability to prepare for those runs and just to continue my running time. And so we just want to thank you so much for watching our presentation. And we just hope that this helped you increase your run, and maybe you'll become a runner one day.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.